Look at a map of the Pacific Ocean, and you'll see something remarkable. A nation of islands, resource poor, and surrounded by water, that became the world's third largest economy. Japan's prosperity seems almost impossible when you consider the numbers. It imports nearly all of its oil, almost all of its natural gas, and more than half of its food. Every day, supertankers carrying millions of barrels of crude oil navigate through narrow straits thousands of miles away, threading through waters controlled by nations with long memories and old grievances. This industrial giant runs on a lifeline stretched across the world's busiest shipping lanes, and that lifeline passes directly through the territorial ambitions of its largest neighbor. The question isn't whether this vulnerability exists. The question is what happens when someone decides to exploit it. Japan's economic miracle rests on a geographic contradiction that has defined its modern history. The country possesses virtually no natural resources of its own. No oil fields, no significant coal deposits, no iron or to speak of. Yet somehow, this chain of volcanic islands transformed itself into an industrial superpower that manufactures everything from automobiles to advanced electronics. The secret was simple: import raw materials, add Japanese ingenuity and work ethic, export finished goods. It's a model that has worked brilliantly for 80 years. But it depends entirely on one thing remaining constant: the free flow of maritime trade through waters that Japan does not control. 80% of Japan's energy supplies pass through the South China Sea. These aren't abstract shipping routes on a map. They're the arteries that keep Japanese society alive. When those tankers stop arriving, the lights go out. Factories shut down. Trains stop running. The convenience stores that define Japanese urban life empty their shelves within days. The entire modern Japanese existence is predicated on the assumption that these sea lanes will remain open, that international law will be respected, that stronger powers will not use geography as a weapon. For most of the post-war era, this assumption held. American aircraft carriers patrolled these waters. The U.S. Navy guaranteed safe passage. Japan could focus on manufacturing and innovation, leaving the security of its supply lines to its most powerful ally. But assumptions that hold for 80 years can breed a particular kind of blindness. Psychologists call it normalcy bias, the tendency to believe that because something hasn't happened, it won't happen. Modern Japan has grown so accustomed to its vulnerability that it has ceased to feel vulnerable. The generation that remembers gin scarcity is dying. Young Japanese have never known a time when the supermarkets weren't full, when gasoline wasn't available, when the economy ground to a halt because the ships stopped coming. This is the paradox of prosperity built on dependency. Success makes the foundation invisible until the moment it cracks. History has seen this pattern before, though the roles were different. In the 19th century, Britain ruled the seas from an island that produced almost nothing its empire needed. Coal and iron, yes, but little else. British power rested on controlling the maritime choke points through which global trade flowed: Gibraltar, Suez, Singapore, the Cape of Good Hope. The British understood something fundamental about island nations: control the water or be controlled by those who do. Japan learned this lesson the hard way. By the late 1930s, Japan faced the same resource dependency that defines it today. The country needed oil, rubber, tin, and iron to sustain its industrial base and military ambitions. Almost all of these materials came from foreign sources, much of it from territories controlled by Western colonial powers. Japanese strategists looked at their maps and saw what they called the Southern Resource Area: the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, French Indochina. These regions held everything Japan needed. They also lay thousands of miles away, protected by the world's most powerful navies. The calculation that followed would lead to catastrophe. In the summer of 1941, the United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan in response to Japanese expansion into Indochina. The effect was immediate and terrifying for Japanese planners. The country had perhaps 2 years of oil reserves at current consumption rates. Every day that passed without a resolution brought Japan closer to complete paralysis. The military would run out of fuel. The economy would collapse. Japan would be forced to abandon its ambitions in China and accept American terms for resuming trade. For the leadership in Tokyo, this was unacceptable. They faced a choice that seemed to offer no good options: surrender their geopolitical position without a fight, or gamble on a war they probably could not win. The psychology of decision-making under scarcity and time pressure drove them toward the second option. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. What's often forgotten about the Pacific War is how it ended. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki dominate the historical memory, and rightly so for their unprecedented destructive power and moral weight. But Japan was already defeated before those weapons fell. The defeat came not through conventional military conquest, though American forces had pushed the Japanese military back across the Pacific. It came through something more insidious and ultimately more effective: economic strangulation. By the spring of 1945, Japan still had more than 4 million troops under arms. The home islands had not been invaded. The government remained intact. Yet Japan was dying. American submarines had spent 3 years hunting Japanese merchant vessels with ruthless efficiency. They sank tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies. They torpedoed freighters bringing rice from Southeast Asia. They destroyed the very supply lines that Japan had gone to war to secure. Then came Operation Starvation, a campaign that most people have never heard of, but which may have done more to end the war than any other single factor. Starting in March of 1945, American B-29 bombers began dropping thousands of magnetic and acoustic mines in the waters around Japan. These weren't the old contact mines that ships could sometimes avoid. These were sophisticated weapons that lay on the seabed and detonated when they detected the magnetic signature or engine noise of passing vessels. The Americans dropped 12,000 of these mines in Japanese ports, harbors, and the narrow straits between the home islands. Within months, Japanese maritime trade had collapsed by 90%. Oil couldn't get in. Food couldn't get in. Even domestic shipping between Japanese islands became nearly impossible. The Japanese people began to starve. Not metaphorically, actually starve. Food rations fell to 1,200 calories per day, then lower. Industrial production stopped almost entirely because no raw materials could reach the factories. The government had troops and weapons, but no fuel to move them, no ammunition to supply them, no way to coordinate a defense of the home islands because the economy itself had ceased to function. This was what defeated Japan, not bombs, but the simple absence of ships moving freely through the water. The emperor's surrender speech in August of 1945 cited the atomic weapons. But Japanese military leaders would later say that the real cause was the impossibility of continuing to feed the population or sustain any kind of organized resistance. This historical experience seared itself into the Japanese consciousness in ways that still echo today. The post-war Japanese constitution, written under American occupation, contains Article 9, which renounces war as a sovereign right and prohibits Japan from maintaining military forces for anything but self-defense. This wasn't just American imposition. It reflected a deep Japanese revulsion toward the militarism that had led the country into catastrophe. The generation that experienced the starvation of 1945 wanted to ensure it could never happen again. They built their pacifism on the memory of what happens when an island nation loses control of the sea. But memory is a strange thing. It shapes those who lived through the events, but it fades with time. The generation that remembers 1945 is almost gone. Modern Japan is prosperous, peaceful, and deeply averse to military confrontation. This is admirable in many ways. It's also a strategic vulnerability that other nations have studied carefully. 8,000 miles away, in Beijing, Chinese military strategists have examined Japan's geographic situation with great interest. They see the same dependency on sea lanes that American planners exploited in 1945. They see the same narrow straits through which energy and food must pass. They see an opportunity. China's relationship with Japan carries historical weight that Americans sometimes fail to appreciate. The Chinese remember the Japanese occupation from 1937 to 1945 with the same visceral intensity that Europeans remember the Nazi occupation. The rape of Nanking, Unit 731's biological experiments, the comfort women system. These aren't distant historical abstractions in China. They're living memories passed down through families, kept alive by government propaganda, and reinforced through popular culture. When Chinese leaders speak of the century of humiliation that China endured from the Opium Wars through World War II, Japan features prominently in that narrative. The current geopolitical competition isn't just about resources or trade routes. It carries psychological freight that makes miscalculation more likely and compromise more difficult. Over the past 3 decades, China has built a navy that now outnumbers the American fleet in total hull count. This isn't a navy designed to project power globally the way the United States Navy does. It's a navy optimized for a specific purpose, denying an adversary access to the waters near China's coast. The strategy has a name in military circles: anti-access area denial, usually shortened to A2/AD. The concept is straightforward. You don't need to defeat the enemy's navy in open battle. You just need to make the cost of operating in your nearby waters so high that they decide it's not worth it. China has invested heavily in weapons designed specifically to threaten American aircraft carriers, the primary tool of U.S. power projection. Anti-ship ballistic missiles like the DF-21D and DF-26 can strike moving ships from more than 2,000 miles away. These carrier killers have never been used in combat, and their effectiveness remains debated by military analysts. But their existence creates uncertainty. A U.S. carrier battle group costs tens of billions of dollars and carries 5,000 sailors. Putting that asset within range of Chinese missiles means accepting a risk that American presidents might not be willing to take, especially if the conflict involves defending islands that most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Below the surface, China has expanded its submarine fleet to more than 60 attack submarines. These aren't as quiet or sophisticated as American submarines, but they don't need to be. Operating close to home, in waters they know intimately, Chinese submarines can complicate American naval operations significantly. They force American ships to move more cautiously, to spend resources on anti-submarine warfare, to consider the possibility that any intervention in the Western Pacific might result in the loss of major vessels and hundreds of lives. Above the surface, China has created something unprecedented: a maritime militia of more than 300 vessels that look like fishing boats, but are actually coordinated by the Chinese military. These ships swarm around disputed features in the South China Sea, establishing Chinese presence without technically deploying naval warships. They harass foreign vessels, gather intelligence, and create facts on the ground, or rather, on the water. It's a strategy that operates below the threshold of conventional warfare, making it difficult to respond without appearing to be the aggressor. The Chinese have studied something that Western military strategists sometimes overlook: Sun Tzu's maxim that supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This isn't just an ancient aphorism. It reflects a fundamentally different approach to conflict than the Western tradition emphasizes. If you compare chess to Go, the Chinese strategy game played on a grid with black and white stones, you see this difference in miniature. Chess is about direct confrontation, clear objectives, decisive battles. Go is about encirclement, patience, accumulating small advantages until the opponent's position becomes untenable. Chinese strategists have studied American military culture and concluded that Americans think like chess players. They're therefore designing strategies that work like Go: incremental, ambiguous, difficult to counter without escalating dramatically. This brings us to the scenario that keeps strategic planners awake at night. What would a modern blockade of Japan actually look like? Forget the dramatic images of Pearl Harbor or naval battles with ships exchanging fire on the horizon. A 21st century blockade would be something far more subtle and therefore more difficult to counter. A graduated campaign of economic pressure that exploits legal gray zones, cyber warfare, and the simple fact that commercial shipping companies will not send their vessels into waters where they might be detained, damaged, or destroyed. Imagine it begins with a crisis over Taiwan or the disputed Senkaku Islands, which Japan controls but China claims as the Diaoyu Islands. The specifics matter less than the pretext. China declares a special security zone in the East China Sea, citing maritime security concerns. All vessels passing through this zone must pre-register with Chinese authorities and submit to inspection. This isn't technically a blockade under international law. It's a security measure. But the effect is the same: uncertainty for shipping companies, delays for vessels, increased insurance premiums, and the beginning of a cascade that could strangle Japanese trade without a shot being fired. In the second phase, Chinese Coast Guard vessels begin escorting tankers, and container ships to Chinese ports for safety inspections that take 3 to 7 days. Not every vessel, just enough to create unpredictability. Some ships are allowed to pass freely. Others are diverted. The pattern is deliberately unclear. Shipping companies can't plan routes with confidence. Insurance companies raise their rates for vessels heading to Japanese ports. Simultaneously, cyber attacks disrupt shipping logistics systems, creating confusion about schedules, port availability, and cargo routing. GPS signals in the region become unreliable due to spoofing by Chinese electronic warfare systems. Still, no weapons have been fired. Still, this remains below the threshold that would trigger a military response. But the effect on Japanese trade is severe. By 6 weeks into this scenario, the economic consequences begin to ripple through Japanese society. Japan maintains strategic petroleum reserves equivalent to about 200 days of normal consumption. This sounds substantial, and it is. But normal consumption patterns change rapidly when people panic. News reports about potential shortages lead to hoarding. Gasoline stations see lines as people top off their tanks and fill spare containers. Industrial users stockpile fuel. What should last 200 days begins to disappear in 30. Meanwhile, the stock market has collapsed. Foreign investors pull capital out of Japan, uncertain whether the economy can function under these conditions. Manufacturing plants that depend on just-in-time delivery of components begin shutting down. Toyota and Honda halt production. Electronics manufacturers can't get the rare earth minerals they need from China, which controls 80% of global supply. Food prices spike as imports slow. Japan produces only 40% of its own food. The rest comes from abroad, much of it through the very shipping lanes that are now compromised. The political pressure on the Japanese government becomes intense. The public sees empty shelves and rising prices. They don't want war. They want the problem fixed through negotiation. South Korea and the Philippines, both American allies in theory, face their own choice: support Japan and risk Chinese economic retaliation against their own trade, or remain neutral and hope the crisis doesn't spread. Neither country has a treaty obligation to defend Japan. Both have significant economic ties to China. The incentive is to stay out of it, to free ride on any eventual American intervention rather than risk their own economic well-being. In Washington, the political calculation is even more fraught. Public opinion polls show that 60% or more of Americans oppose going to war over islands they've never heard of. The president faces what philosophers call a trolley problem. Inaction leads to slow-motion catastrophe for an ally, but action risks a war with a nuclear-armed power that could kill millions. Every day of hesitation makes the situation worse, but decisive action could make it catastrophically worse. Meanwhile, European allies urge caution and negotiation. They have their own trade relationships with China to consider. They don't want to choose sides in what they view as a regional Asian dispute. The alliance structure that protected Japan for 80 years begins to show cracks under pressure that it was never really designed to withstand. After 3 months of this graduated pressure, China offers an off-ramp. Accept a new normal in the East China Sea. Acknowledge Chinese sovereignty over the disputed islands. Agree to coordinate all maritime security measures with Beijing. In exchange, the security zone is lifted, shipping returns to normal, and the crisis ends. Japan hasn't been invaded. No cities have been bombed. But the strategic situation in East Asia has fundamentally changed. Japan has accepted Chinese dominance over waters it depends on for survival. American credibility as a security guarantor has been damaged. Other nations in the region recalculate their own positions based on the demonstrated reality that the United States will not risk war to protect distant allies when the costs become too high. This scenario rests on several assumptions about human psychology and decision-making that are worth examining. First, it assumes that leaders will make rational calculations based on costs and benefits. But history suggests that crises rarely unfold rationally. The July crisis of 1914 shows how a localized conflict between Austria and Serbia spiraled into World War I through a series of miscalculations, misunderstandings, and commitments that national leaders felt they couldn't abandon without losing credibility. None of the major powers wanted a continental war. Most thought it would be a short, limited conflict. They were catastrophically wrong. The same dynamic could apply to a crisis over Japan. A collision between naval vessels, intended or accidental, could force leaders to respond more forcefully than they intended. A cyber attack might be misattributed, leading to retaliation against the wrong target. A submarine commander, operating under rules of engagement that require split-second decisions, might fire on what he perceives as a threat, triggering an escalation spiral that no one can control. Modern weapons systems, increasingly automated and AI-enabled, make decisions faster than human beings can process information. The compression of decision time from weeks in World War II to minutes in modern warfare means that mistakes can cascade into catastrophe before anyone fully understands what's happening. Psychological research on decision-making under stress reveals patterns that should concern anyone thinking about great power conflict. Groupthink, the tendency of decision-making bodies to converge on a consensus view and suppress dissent, becomes more pronounced in crisis situations. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy administration came very close to launching airstrikes against Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Most of the president's advisors supported this option. Only a few voices urged caution, and they were initially dismissed. It was only through extraordinary leadership and some luck that Kennedy chose the more measured approach of a naval blockade rather than immediate military action. We came frighteningly close to nuclear war because a room full of intelligent, well-meaning people fell into the psychological trap of assuming that their preferred course of action must be correct because everyone agreed with it. The same dynamic could play out in Beijing, Washington, or Tokyo. Authoritarian systems like China's are particularly vulnerable to groupthink because dissenting voices can be dangerous to one's career or liberty. But democracies aren't immune. In polarized societies, national security teams can become echo chambers where certain viewpoints are never seriously considered because they're associated with the wrong political tribe. Social media amplifies these tendencies, creating separate information ecosystems where people encounter only views that confirm their existing beliefs. In a crisis, this could mean that large segments of the American public are receiving completely different accounts of what's happening and why, making it nearly impossible to build the consensus needed for sustained military action. There's another psychological factor at work in modern conflicts that didn't exist in previous eras: the role of domestic politics in constraining or driving foreign policy decisions. In democracies, leaders who make public threats and then back down face what international relations scholars call audience costs. They lose credibility. Opposition parties exploit their perceived weakness. The next election becomes harder to win. This creates perverse incentives. A leader might privately recognize that backing down from a confrontation is the wise choice, but publicly doing so carries political penalties that make it nearly impossible. Autocratic leaders face different but related pressures. Xi Jinping has tied his personal legitimacy to the idea of Chinese national rejuvenation and the recovery of territories that China considers wrongfully separated from the motherland. Backing down from a confrontation over Taiwan or disputed islands could be seen as weakness that threatens his position within the Communist Party. The internal politics of maintaining power can drive leaders toward decisions that are strategically irrational but politically necessary. Economics adds another layer of complexity to this scenario. Japan holds more than $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. China holds a similar amount. These cross-border financial holdings create mutual vulnerability that's unprecedented in history. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union had virtually no economic relationship. Each could threaten the other without worrying about disrupting trade or financial markets. The U.S.-China relationship is fundamentally different. The economies are deeply integrated. American companies depend on Chinese manufacturing. Chinese companies depend on American consumers. This interdependence was supposed to make conflict unthinkable because both sides would suffer too much economic damage. But weaponized interdependence cuts both ways. Nations that control critical nodes in global economic networks, shipping choke points, rare earth mineral supplies, advanced semiconductor manufacturing, gain leverage precisely because others depend on them. China has demonstrated a willingness to use economic coercion for political ends. When Australia called for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, China imposed tariffs on Australian wine, barley, and coal. When Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open a representative office using its own name rather than Chinese Taipei, China blocked Lithuanian exports. These weren't military actions. They were economic punishment designed to change political behavior. A blockade of Japan would be the same strategy applied on a scale that could reshape the global order. The question of whether China would actually implement such a strategy depends partly on how Chinese leaders perceive the costs and benefits. Blockading Japan would certainly damage China's own economy. Trade would suffer. Global condemnation would be intense. But autocratic governments can absorb economic pain more easily than democracies can. China's domestic market is now large enough that the country is less dependent on exports than it was 2 decades ago. The Communist Party has demonstrated a willingness to prioritize political objectives over economic growth when it deems necessary. If Chinese leaders believe that asserting control over Japan's sea lanes would establish Chinese dominance in East Asia and demonstrate that the era of American primacy has ended, they might calculate that the economic costs are worth paying. There's also a temporal dimension to consider. Chinese strategic planning operates on time frames that democratic politicians struggle to match. Xi Jinping has effectively made himself leader for life. He speaks of the China dream to be achieved by 2049, the centennial of the People's Republic. This is planning in terms of decades and generations. American presidents think in terms of 4-year election cycles. They're accountable to voters who care more about inflation and healthcare than about abstract questions of strategic positioning in the Western Pacific. This asymmetry in time horizons is itself a strategic advantage. The side that can be patient, that can wait for the right moment, that can accept temporary setbacks in service of long-term objectives, has an edge over the side that needs visible wins before the next election. Cultural factors also shape how different societies think about conflict and sacrifice. Japanese culture emphasizes the concept of giri, a sense of obligation and duty that creates powerful social bonds, but also constraints. Japan's obligation to the United States for providing security guarantees since 1945 is deeply felt by the Japanese establishment. But how much are ordinary Japanese citizens willing to sacrifice to maintain that relationship? American culture tends toward pragmatic cost-benefit analysis. When the costs of maintaining a commitment start to seem higher than the benefits, American public opinion can shift rapidly. The Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War all followed a pattern where initial public support eroded as casualties mounted and victory remained elusive. A conflict over Japan's sea lanes wouldn't involve American casualties in the same direct way, but the economic costs could be enormous. Would the American public accept a deep recession, disrupted supply chains, and potential military escalation to defend an ally that many Americans know little about? These questions don't have clear answers, which is precisely what makes the scenario so dangerous. Uncertainty creates opportunities for miscalculation. If Chinese leaders believe that the United States will not intervene militarily to protect Japan's sea lanes, they might initiate a crisis that spirals beyond their control. If American leaders believe they must intervene to maintain credibility but underestimate China's willingness to escalate, they might stumble into a conflict neither side wanted. If Japanese leaders believe they can rely on American protection and therefore don't need to develop their own capabilities to secure their sea lanes, they might find themselves abandoned in a crisis. These are the kinds of strategic dilemmas that have led to wars throughout history, even when no one actually wanted war. So what can be done to prevent this scenario? The answers are neither simple nor cheap, and they require political will that democracies often struggle to generate in the absence of an immediate crisis. Japan faces constitutional and cultural constraints on expanding its military capabilities. Article 9 of its constitution, the very pacifism born from the trauma of 1945, makes it difficult to build the kind of navy that could independently defend Japanese sea lanes. Public opinion remains opposed to militarization despite the changing strategic environment. The Japanese population is aging rapidly, with a median age of 49. The pool of young people available for military service is shrinking. Defense spending remains around 1% of GDP, far below China's estimated 3 to 4%. Simply matching Chinese military investment would require politically difficult choices about taxes, domestic spending, and national identity. Japan has taken some steps toward diversification. It's exploring Arctic shipping routes that bypass the South China Sea entirely, though these are only viable part of the year and add significant time and cost to deliveries. It's expanding strategic reserves of petroleum and natural gas, but storing enough to outlast a prolonged blockade would require massive infrastructure investments. It's modernizing its self-defense forces with F-35 fighters and Aegis destroyers, developing capabilities that blur the line between defense and offense. It's participating in the Quad alliance with the United States, India, and Australia, creating a framework for maritime security cooperation. But none of these measures fundamentally solve the underlying geographic vulnerability. Japan remains an island nation dependent on imports traveling through waters it cannot fully control. The United States maintains forward deployment in Japan with the 7th Fleet based at Yokosuka and Marine Forces in Okinawa. This is meant to provide deterrence. Any attack on Japan would automatically involve American forces, making it too costly for China to contemplate. But the credibility of extended deterrence depends on the threat being believable. As China's anti-access capabilities grow, as the risk to American carriers increases, as domestic opposition to foreign war strengthens, does the American commitment remain credible? Would a president really risk Los Angeles to defend Tokyo? The very asking of the question undermines the deterrent effect. Economic solutions face their own challenges. Reshoring or friendshoring supply chains, moving production out of China to allied countries or back to domestic facilities, is theoretically possible but practically difficult. It would increase costs for consumer goods by 20 to 40%. The time frame for major industrial relocation is 10 to 15 years, not a quick fix to an immediate threat. Japan's energy independence strategies face political and technical obstacles. Nuclear power expansion would be the most straightforward solution to reducing dependence on imported oil and gas, but it's politically toxic after the Fukushima disaster. Renewable energy requires decades of investment and doesn't solve the immediate problem. Japan is betting heavily on a hydrogen economy, but the technology is still nascent and unproven at scale. There's a theory in international relations that economic entanglement itself provides deterrence. If China's economy depends on global trade, if Chinese prosperity requires stable shipping lanes and functioning international markets, then any action that disrupts this system would hurt China as much as it hurts Japan. The problem with this theory is that it assumes both sides weight economic costs the same way. Democracies, where leaders depend on voter approval and where economic downturns can end political careers, may be more sensitive to economic pain than autocracies where the leadership can impose costs on the population without facing electoral consequences. China's domestic market has grown large enough that the country is less dependent on exports than it once was. The Communist Party has demonstrated a willingness to accept slower growth or even economic contraction if it advances political objectives like control over Hong Kong or intimidation of Taiwan. Diplomatic solutions exist in theory, but have proven difficult to implement in practice. ASEAN and China have been negotiating a code of conduct for maritime disputes since 2002 without reaching a binding agreement. The problem is enforcement. No international body has the power to compel compliance from great powers. The United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea provides a framework for resolving disputes, but the United States never ratified it, and China has ignored rulings it doesn't like, including a tribunal decision that rejected Chinese claims in the South China Sea. The G7, European Union, and Quad can issue statements condemning aggressive behavior, but statements without consequences are just words. Crisis communication channels exist between the U.S. and Chinese militaries, but they have a history of being ignored during actual crises. Track 2 Diplomacy, unofficial dialogue between retired officials, academics, and think tank experts, helps maintain understanding and personal relationships, but it can't substitute for genuine political will to compromise on core interests. And that's the fundamental problem. Both China and Japan view the disputed islands and surrounding waters as core interests, not peripheral concerns that can be traded away. For China, it's about historical justice and national rejuvenation. For Japan, it's about territorial integrity and not rewarding aggression. Core interests are by definition non-negotiable, which makes diplomatic solutions extremely difficult. Underlying all of these practical challenges are psychological and cultural barriers that make prevention even harder. Normalcy bias affects not just Japan, but the entire international community. It hasn't happened in 80 years, so people assume it won't happen. Policymakers and publics prioritize immediate issues like inflation, healthcare, and climate change over distant threats that seem speculative. This is rational in a sense. There are always more immediate problems demanding attention, but it's how countries sleepwalk into crises that everyone later claims they should have seen coming. Political short-termism compounds the problem. Democratic leaders face election cycles that reward visible accomplishments within a few years. Long-term strategic investments that might pay off decades from now don't win votes today. This creates a systematic bias toward underinvestment in prevention and over-reliance on deterrence that may not hold. Xi Jinping, by contrast, has made himself effectively president for life. He can plan in terms of decades. He can wait for the right moment. He can accept temporary setbacks knowing that time is on his side. This is patience as a strategic weapon, and it's one that democracies struggle to counter. The cultural dimension runs deeper than most people realize. Chinese strategic thinking is shaped by centuries of history where power was measured not by territorial conquest, but by the acknowledgement of centrality, the idea of China as the middle kingdom around which other nations orbited in a hierarchical relationship. This isn't about empire in the European sense of direct colonial rule. It's about a sphere of influence where smaller states acknowledge Chinese primacy and adjust their behavior accordingly. From this perspective, the current international order based on sovereign equality and rules-based institutions is itself an aberration, a temporary imposition by Western powers during China's century of weakness. The goal isn't to replicate American global hegemony, but to restore what Chinese leaders view as the natural order of East Asia. American strategic culture, shaped by very different historical experiences, struggles to understand this worldview. Americans think in terms of democracy versus autocracy, open societies versus closed ones, universal values that apply everywhere. The idea that spheres of influence might be legitimate, that great powers might naturally dominate their regions, that international order might be hierarchical rather than equal. These concepts feel wrong to American sensibilities. This cultural disconnect makes negotiations difficult because each side is operating from fundamentally different assumptions about what a legitimate international order looks like. There's a philosophical question embedded in all of this about whether great power conflict is inevitable or whether institutions and economic interdependence can prevent it. Realist international relations theory says that when a rising power challenges an established power, conflict is nearly inevitable. This is sometimes called the Thucydides trap, after the ancient Greek historian who observed that the rise of Athens and the fear this created in Sparta made war inevitable. Looking at history, the pattern seems to support this view. Spain and Britain fought. Britain and France fought. Britain and Germany fought twice. The United States and Soviet Union engaged in a Cold War that could easily have turned hot. The counterargument points to the one major exception: the peaceful transition of global leadership from Britain to the United States in the early 20th century. This happened because the two countries shared cultural values, democratic institutions, and ultimately common interests that outweighed their competition. The liberal international relations school argues that trade interdependence, democratic governance, and international institutions can prevent war between great powers because the costs of conflict become too high and the mechanisms for peaceful resolution become strong enough. The problem is that China and the United States don't share the factors that made the Anglo-American transition peaceful. Different political systems, different cultural values, different views on human rights and governance, and territorial disputes that didn't exist in the Atlantic world. The liberal model may work among democracies, but not across the divide between democracies and autocracies. We are left, then, with an unsettling equilibrium. The most dangerous geopolitical flashpoint of our time is also one of the least discussed in mainstream public discourse. People worry about Ukraine, about the Middle East, about terrorism and domestic political divisions. The possibility that China might blockade Japan, strangling the world's third-largest economy, and triggering a cascade that could lead to global conflict, remains an abstract concern for specialists rather than a topic of urgent public debate. This is partly because the scenario seems so unlikely to people who have lived their entire lives in a world where such things don't happen. It's partly because the mechanisms of a modern blockade, insurance rates, shipping logistics, cyber attacks, are less visceral and comprehensible than images of bombing and invasion. And it's partly because facing the implications honestly would require difficult choices and expensive investments that no one wants to make. The current equilibrium rests on three assumptions. First, that American military primacy in the Western Pacific remains sufficient to deter Chinese aggression. Second, that Chinese leaders will continue to show restraint in pressing their territorial claims and strategic objectives. Third, that global economic integration makes major conflict too costly for anyone to seriously consider. All three of these assumptions are eroding. American military primacy is being challenged by Chinese investments in anti-access capabilities. Chinese restraint is being tested incrementally through gray zone tactics that normalize Chinese presence in disputed waters. And economic integration, rather than preventing conflict, has created new forms of leverage that can be weaponized. History suggests that every major power transition involves conflict of some kind. The list is long and sobering. The decline of Spain and the rise of Britain. The competition between Britain and France. The rise of Germany and its challenge to British dominance. The emergence of the United States as a global power and its competition with the Soviet Union. Only one transition occurred peacefully, Britain to the United States, and that was facilitated by shared culture, democratic values, and common threats that pushed the two countries together rather than apart. China and the United States share none of these factors. Different political systems, different cultural traditions, competing views on international order, and territorial disputes that create genuine flashpoints. What makes the current situation different from the Cold War is that the United States and Soviet Union had limited economic ties. Trade between the two was minimal. Their economies operated on different principles and served different markets. They could threaten each other without worrying about disrupting supply chains or financial markets. China and the United States are profoundly different. They're deeply integrated economically. American companies depend on Chinese manufacturing. Chinese companies depend on American consumers and technology. This was supposed to make conflict unthinkable. Instead, it's created new forms of vulnerability that can be exploited short of war. The weapons in this new kind of conflict aren't just missiles and submarines. They're shipping insurance rates that make trade unprofitable. They're rare earth mineral supplies that can be cut off to cripple high-tech manufacturing. They're cyber attacks that disrupt logistics systems and create chaos without firing a shot. It's the invisible flows of global commerce, the networks of trade and finance that knit the modern world together and which can be weaponized by those who control critical nodes. Whether China will actually attempt to blockade Japan depends on decisions being made right now in Beijing, Washington, and Tokyo, decisions that most people will never hear about until it's too late. It depends on how Xi Jinping assesses the trajectory of Chinese power relative to American power. It depends on whether he believes that a window of opportunity exists before Japan and the United States can adequately respond to China's growing capabilities. It depends on domestic political pressures within China that outsiders poorly understand. It depends on whether an unexpected crisis, over Taiwan, over disputed islands, over some incident that hasn't happened yet, creates a moment where long-term strategic planning gives way to immediate tactical decisions made under pressure. It also depends on choices that Americans and Japanese make about how much they're willing to invest in prevention, how much economic cost they'll accept to maintain strategic independence, how much political capital their leaders will spend on threats that seem distant and abstract until they're suddenly immediate and concrete. The tragedy of prevention is that it's expensive, politically unrewarding, and if it works, nothing happens. The crisis that doesn't occur because of deterrence and preparation looks, to casual observers, like wasted effort and unnecessary expense. Only when prevention fails do people realize what they should have been worried about all along. We're living in a world that's paradoxically more interconnected and more dangerous than at any time since 1945. The networks that link us together, trade, finance, communication, travel, create prosperity and cultural exchange. They also create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand that interdependence cuts both ways. A nation that controls choke points in global networks gains asymmetric leverage. A nation willing to accept economic pain can impose even greater pain on nations more sensitive to market disruptions and public opinion. A nation with patient, Long-term strategy can exploit the short-term focus and political divisions of democracies. The question of whether humanity can break the historical pattern of great power conflict remains unanswered. We have institutions that didn't exist in previous eras: the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, international courts and treaties. We have economic integration that makes conflict costly in ways that weren't true in the past. We have nuclear weapons that make major war potentially civilization-ending rather than merely destructive. These factors should provide powerful incentives for peace. But they haven't eliminated the underlying dynamics that drive great power competition: the desire for security, the fear of being dominated, the pursuit of status and recognition, the domestic political pressures that push leaders toward confrontation even when they might personally prefer compromise. The blockade of Japan, if it comes, will likely not be announced with a declaration of war or a Pearl Harbor-style attack. It will be incremental, ambiguous, deniable. It will exploit legal gray zones and the reluctance of other nations to intervene in what can be framed as a regional dispute. It will test the credibility of American security commitments and the cohesion of democratic alliances. It will happen if it happens because someone decided that the potential benefits outweighed the risks, or because a crisis spiraled beyond anyone's control, or because the slow accumulation of small advantages reached a tipping point where the strategic balance had fundamentally shifted. Look again at that map of the Pacific, at those shipping lanes carrying oil. They're beautiful from space. They're also fragile in ways that most people never consider until the moment they stop flowing. The answer to whether China will blockade Japan is not determined by technology or geography or economics alone. It's determined by human decisions made under uncertainty by leaders trying to balance risks they can't fully calculate, by publics responding to events they don't fully understand, by the accumulated weight of history and culture and psychology pressing on choices that will shape the future. The decisions are being made now, quietly, in rooms where most of us will never see. By the time the consequences become visible, it may be too late to choose a different path. That's the real vulnerability, more profound than any geographic constraint. The gap between the moment when prevention is possible and the moment when everyone realizes it's necessary.